Hello everyone. My name is Filiz Çakır Philip, curator at the Aga Khan Museum. I welcome you all to today's lecture. Before I introduce our famous guest, I would like to provide some background information on this lecture. In 2016, I started communicating with Beryl Collection in Glasgow to request the Wagner Garden Carpet as temporary loan for our permanent gallery. Finally, in February this year, we were able to display this magnificent carpet in our gallery, only to be locked down in mid-March due to COVID-19. The display of the carpet was planned to run until mid-August, but yet again, due to COVID-19, we were able to extend the duration of its display until January 21. I can therefore encourage you to come and visit our wonderful museum to get this unique chance of experiencing the Wagner Garden Carpet. I reached out Professor Walter Denny to express our wish to invite him to give a lecture related to this carpet. After several postponing of the lecture, we are finally able to come together, some of us in the auditorium of the Aga Khan Museum, some of us attending virtually from around the world. Professor Walter Denny is a distinguished scholar of the art and architecture of Islamic world. In particular, the artistic traditions of the Ottoman Turks, Islamic carpets and textiles, and issues of economics and patronage in Islamic art. Besides his teaching activities at the university, he has held curatorial positions at the Harvard University Art Museums, the Smith College Museum of Art, and the Textile Museum, Washington, D.C., where he was a trustee for 6 years in the 1980s, and is currently Charles Grant Ellis Research Associate in Islamic Carpets. From 2007 to 2017, he was Senior Consultant in the Department of Islamic Art, Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. Walter Denny has curated more than 24 exhibitions and is the author of over 200 publications on Islamic art. Among them, 2 textile museum exhibitions, The Classical Tradition in Anatolian Carpets and The Sultan's Garden, include catalogs co-authored with Sumri Krodi. How to Read Islamic Carpets was published by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2015, my favorite to recommend. And The Carpet and the Connoisseur accompanied his carpet exhibition at the St. Louis Art Museum in 2016. In 2012, he received the George Hewitt Myers Award for Lifetime Achievement in the Textile Scholarship from the Textile Museum. We were very pleased to have Walter Denny at the Aga Khan Museum during the exhibition The Arts of the East, Highlights of Islamic Art from the Bruscutini collection in 2017. And today, we are very honored to have you, Walter, with us. Dear Walter, over to you.
I'm delighted to be here today to join you all. The Gardens of Eternal Bliss is basically a Quranic translation. We all know that gardens are a very powerful image in the Islamic world. Now, most of us probably realize that gardens are, like almost every other aspect of our visual environment, highly culturally specific. Very few people would have any difficulty, I think, in identifying a Japanese garden among these 4 images that I'm showing you here in the upper left-hand side. The very elaborate former French formal urban garden in the lower left-hand side is another good example of a very culturally specific type of garden design, with the gravel paths, and the festooned vines in the background. An English garden on a beautiful estate in Somerset, with its roses and nicely clipped hedges and immaculate velvet-like lawn that you see in the lower right-hand corner here, is likewise fairly culturally specific, although the addition of those tiled roofs and wall elements suggest this is an English garden with Italian pretensions as well. And then something quite unusual in the upper right-hand corner, a garden in the United States of America built around a small stream, which has been turned into an element of the garden. So gardens have, as all works of art do, they have a style of place, they have a style of time, and they have a style frequently of individual artist, the landscape architect or artist who designed the garden. Now, gardens are very important in the creation mythologies, as we know, of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. We have and the story of the expulsion from the garden has in it a number of rather important aspects. First of all, the Garden of Eden was a walled garden. You were inside or you were outside, but there was, and when in the Christian version that we see here, when the angel with the sword expels Adam and Eve from paradise, they are expelled through a gateway, which you can see on the right-hand side here in Masaccios' famous frescoes. In the case of the Falname created in Istanbul around 1600 on the right-hand side here, it's a little bit more of a no-fault expulsion from paradise. There's not as much grief. Adam and Eve and their little fig leaves are walking through what appears to be as much floral garden without as there was within, while an angel looks at the entire thing on the with wonder. The snake is the angel and the peacock look out the door of paradise, and the snake is expelled along with Adam and Eve. So this is a shared myth of the three great monotheistic religions that originated in the Middle East, but it is also the image of a garden actually occurs in many, many other religious traditions as part of creation myth. Now, the gardens of paradise are very completely described in the Quran. The Quran, as you know, is the literal word of God, recited in Arabic poetry and eventually written down after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And the Quran holds forth paradise as the reward for those who have followed a life of righteousness on earth. What you can see in these two images to either side here is something that's rather startling. We're not used to seeing depictions of the Prophet in Islamic art, and indeed, many people would consider these depictions blasphemous. I can tell you that the patron of this manuscript was a very devout Muslim, Shah Rukh of Herat. But we see here from a manuscript that tells us the story of how the Prophet Muhammad, on the back of this strange beast called Burak, was taken by the Archangel Gabriel and was allowed alone among human beings to see what paradise was like before actually getting there. And we see pretty much what the Quran tells us. That is, beautiful green grass, streams running through it. They used to be silver, but they've tarnished to black now. Flowers everywhere, especially flowering trees of all kinds. The silken cushions to lie on. All the kinds of things that a devout Muslim is supposed to shun in this world are available there in the next, including these chaste companions, the Houris of paradise, who populate both of these paintings. In a much simpler way, in the mihrab or prayer niche of the tomb of Sultan Mehmed I in Bursa, created around 1420, we can see a simplified version of paradise as flowers beyond this beautiful arched gateway. And we see the flowers of paradise, but we also see a hanging lamp depicted in ceramic, which is the metaphor for God, and two candles also giving out light, one of which bears the name of God and the other of the prophet, of the messenger. So there are many different ways of showing paradise in Islamic art, drawing on the Quran, and they are found throughout the history of Islam in a number of different media. Now, there's another aspect to this. However, the word paradise is actually a Persian word, paradisa, or which becomes paradisos in in Greek and in Firdaus in modern Persian, and it means a walled garden. And I show you one of the most famous of the Iranian walled gardens here, the Shahzade Mahan Garden near Kerman in central Persia, and you can see that it's got a very thick and an impressive wall all the way around it. Why is it a walled garden? Well, to separate, as you can see here, the irrigated land, which is irrigated at enormous expense and with great difficulty, from the surrounding desert that forms most of the topography of, indeed, most of the Islamic world. The garden must be surrounded by a wall in order to preserve it against depredations of people who might come and break the branches of the trees or steal the fruit or chop down the trees for firewood. It becomes a very precious sort of place. And the walled garden metaphor, therefore, in conjunction with the Quranic idea of this, of the garden with rivers flowing through it, these two strains come together to form this image of the garden in Islamic art. Now, again, what's the reason for the wall? What does the wall protect? And why does a patch of green in the middle of the desert have such sharp demarcations as you see here? In the West, in large parts of the West, and certainly in North America, we are not accustomed we don't have a great deal of desert except, or irrigated land, except in certain parts of California and in certain parts of the Southwest of the United States. The fact is that cultivatable land has to be separated from the non-cultivatable land for two reasons. One is, of course, to safeguard the economic value of the crops that you can grow when things are irrigated. The other thing equally important, which people don't think about very much, is that the marginal land that you see here in the immediate foreground and in the background is usually, through much of the Middle East, populated by sheep. And if you know anything at all about sheep, you know that you have to keep them out of your garden because sheep eat everything and they pull up plants by the roots. They don't simply eat the grass, they pull it out of the ground. So it's very important that there be a wall around all of this. Now, the water that most of us today, especially those of us from large urban areas, take for granted is something that is not taken for granted in the Middle East. I like to point out to my students at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst that the town of Amherst, during term time in a normal year, there would be over 30,000 students in the town of Amherst, in addition to the regular people who dwell here. And yet the water department of the town of Amherst has 6 full-time employees. And that's enough to take care of the water needs of all of us in the town of Amherst. In fact, in the Middle East, there are parts of the Middle East where as many as 1 person out of every 10 is fully occupied in bringing water to the other 9. The Middle East is largely arid, and therefore water is not only scarce, but since we always value the highest, that which we cannot have, water is also sacred. And water sometimes comes from simple wells in the desert, as you can see near Aksaray in Turkey on the left-hand side here. It's brought to the urban setting and provided to urban dwellers in beautiful fountains, as you see in Marrakesh, Morocco, in the center here, and sometimes even sold or distributed in the streets by water sellers. This rather picturesque one here from Rabat, Morocco. Another aspect of water that makes it especially sacred in the Islamic sense is the religious ritual that immediately precedes the 5 daily prayers, known as wudu. And wudu is a ritual washing. I like to tell my students all the places your mother told you to wash when you were a kid: your feet above the ankles, your hands above the wrists, the back of your neck, your ears, your face, and you do this. Before it's sort of it's not only a symbolic purification, it is an actual purification. People have pointed out that the Islamic prayer is very good for you because not only are you washing up 5 times a day, and certainly in the time of COVID, we need to wash our hands frequently, but also in addition to that, once you get in and actually pray, you're undertaking a certain number of calisthenics. You're bowing, you're kneeling, you're leaning forward and putting your forehead on the ground. All of these are very good for your muscle tone. So water and religious ritual mixed together in both practical and symbolic ways in the Islamic ritual of prayer. How does this water get from, in an arid society, from where it originates to where it is needed? Well, in Iran especially, all over the Islamic world, but especially in Iran, an engineering device known as a qanat, which is a subterranean tunnel that is excavated by shafts that are sunk sometimes many hundreds of feet into the ground. And the detritus from the sinking of the shafts, you can see from an aerial view, the way it appears in the landscape on the right-hand side here. This allows water-bearing strata from the mountains it allows the tapping of these water-bearing subterranean strata to bring water to the urban scene where people can use it, or down into the valleys where it can serve as irrigation for crops. The ingenuity of ancient Middle Eastern hydraulic technology is mind-boggling. It's not my purpose here to go into a lot of it in detail, but I would point out, among other things, that the Noria, which is a water wheel that is propelled by the current, uses the energy from the current of a river also to lift water up in buckets to a higher water course. And this, one can still see this in Syria, in Hama on the left-hand side, if it's still there. And on the right-hand side, in a very famous manuscript from the illustrated manuscript, the Romance of Bayad and Rayad in the Vatican libraries, which also shows us a scene from a romance with a water wheel plainly indicated by the painter. The last piece of putting together this sort of introduction is something that is quite specific to Persia, but spreads all over the Islamic world. And that is a particular type of garden known as the four-part garden, or the Chahar Bagh. The Chahar Bagh, which frequently had in the middle of a fourfold garden a palace where the ruler could sit and look out on the surrounding garden, is apparently comes into being on a large scale for the first time in Pasargadae, the capital of Cyrus the Great, in the 6th century BCE. Excavations there have allowed us to make reconstructions of what the garden looked like, and you'll see that it is, like all the gardens we've looked at, essentially very rectilinear. It's a rectangle, and this rectangle is divided up into with two main axes that meet at the palace, which is D on the plan on the left-hand side here. And there are water courses that form a sort of a cross, in this particular case, two crosses. And the entire thing is surrounded, as you can see here, by a very thick wall to protect both the garden and the ruler and his palace. And this Persian idea becomes an Islamic symbol. Perhaps the most famous Chahar Bagh in all the Islamic world, and certainly in the Western Islamic world, is today found in Granada, in Spain, in the famous Patio de los Leones, the courtyard of the lions, in the famous Alhambra Palace of Granada from the 14th century. But we see it also in the vast, enormous palace in Samarra, Iraq, on the banks of the Tigris River. We see it in Pakistan in the famous Shalimar Gardens that have become almost mythic in the West. And indeed, the most famous perfume from the French house of Guerlain is known as Shalimar. It's probably the only perfume that I can actually recognize, and from my relative male ignorance of these things. And we can see gardens in this rectilinear Chahar Bagh form, or a variant of it, in places like Palermo in Sicily, where this Muslim hunting lodge, known as L'Aziza, that is, it was actually Al-Aziz, the noble palace, created in the Islamic style for a Christian ruler, in the 12th century, today sits on a height, and in front of it, surrounded by modern apartment buildings, the remainder of the large Chahar Bagh or fourfold garden with all of its rectilinear plots that was part of this entire complex in the town of Palermo. And in Constantinople itself, here's an early 17th century rather crude woodcut from a book on a pilgrimage to Constantinople in Jerusalem, which was published in Nuremberg in 1608. And we can see here the Kaiser's Lustgarten, the Sultan's Pleasure Garden in Istanbul, shown in this rather crude woodcut, again in the cruciform plan of the Chahar Bagh, or the fourfold garden. And of course, it became a significant export as well. And we see in the French formal gardens and the Italian ones, so the Boboli Gardens in Florence, perhaps the best known, that come up in the time of the Renaissance and Baroque, are lineal descendants of the fourfold Paradisos garden, the Firdaus garden of Iran. And of course, in more recent times, certainly the rectangles laid out in front of the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto echo in the orderly rows of flowering trees here, and these beautiful, almost mirror-like pools of water, the classical Islamic garden with its roots that go back well over 2,500 years. At times in Islamic history, gardens even became a royal mania. The most famous garden maker in Islamic history is Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty in India, who conquered northern India in the early 16th century. In several different copies that have survived of his autobiography, known as the Babur Nama, and I'm showing you three different illustrations here from three different manuscripts, you can see Babur himself, in some cases, presiding over the construction of gardens, the most famous of which he had made in Kabul, in Afghanistan, and others were eventually made in India. Now, Babur is an interesting character because he's a Chagatai Turk. His language is Chagatai Turkish, the language that was spoken at the Timurid courts. And yet his culture that he founds in India, which is a strange place to found a Persian culture, is essentially very much linked to the great mega culture of Persia. So we have all of these things coming together in Mughal India in the creation of numerous fourfold Chahar Bagh gardens there. Finally, the gardens that we're looking at here, and I promise you we're going to get to rugs in a second here, they become, in especially in later Islamic art, a conflation of royal and divine visual imagery. By a careful analysis of the inscription that we read on the Taj Mahal in Agra, we can understand that the builders of this enormous royal tomb, and we all know the story that it was created supposedly for a beloved wife by who died after marrying God knows how many children to the Emperor Shah Jahan, that the Taj Mahal is a dynastic tomb. It proclaims the wealth and power of the Mughal dynasty. But from the inscriptions, we know that it is also intended to be a metaphor for the throne of God on earth. Gigantic Firdaus in front of it, one of the largest fourfold gardens in the Islamic world, is in fact a metaphor for paradise with the throne of God at one end. And this same idea of conflation of the divine ruler and the earthly ruler, we can see in the central image here, a palace, a very famous palace, the so-called 40 columns pavilion in Isfahan, with the axial pool in front of it, and even also in Isfahan, the early 18th century college of the mother of the Shah that we see on the left-hand image here, which is also laid out in the middle of a fourfold garden. Now, the garden imagery moves from gardens itself into all kinds of works of art in the Islamic world. And to finish the first half of this talk, I just want to show you some of the more amazing examples. The idea, remember, of the walled garden is that it is accessed through a gateway. And the image of the gateway, the Arabic word is bab, doorway, is found everywhere in Islamic art. The prayer rug on the left-hand side in a private collection in Belgium shows us a view through the gateway into a heaven in which there's an enormous chrysanthemum plant symbolizing the flowers of paradise. On the right-hand side, and there's some textual basis for this, there is a threefold gateway to paradise. The presence of God is symbolized by the lamp that hangs in the central arch, this in the famous Ballard prayer rug at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And in the middle, a Turkish tile panel from a royal tomb in Istanbul, in which we see, again, the idea of the arch. And through the arch, we can see this very elaborate floral, symmetrical floral design, which is meant to evoke the idea of paradise. More examples from Samarkand, tile mosaic on the left-hand side, from Vienna, from the Museum für Angewandte Kunst, an Ottoman Turkish prayer rug with lots and lots of flowers in it, seen through the arch. In the center, an Indian printed cotton known as a palampur, in which the symbols in paradise include the birds of paradise, that is to say, the peacocks, the peafowl, the male peafowl, and also this particular form here, which is that of a cypress tree. A cypress tree has two almost antithetical meanings in Islamic civilization. One, it is a sacred symbol, and it is found planted, especially in graveyards all over the Islamic world. It also, in Persian, is one of the most constant metaphors for a beautiful woman, who is constantly compared in Persian lyric poetry to a stately cypress tree. More examples here. This is paper cutting, decoupage, a very famous example from an Ottoman album in Vienna, showing an entire garden with cypress trees and flowering plants of all sorts, all cut out of paper, microscopically tiny little blossoms here. A close-up of another one from Istanbul over here. You can see this flowering plant. So decoupage was one of the art forms in which we see this floral manifestation. A tile panel from Istanbul, Turkey, a polychrome stone from the Topkapı Palace in Istanbul, again at the bottom, the vase of flowers symbolizing paradise, the water which comes out of the middle of the vase, of course, associated with the garden and paradise, and a beautiful example from the Metropolitan Museum of a Turkish brocaded silk, a fragment of a garment. In calligraphy, the most prestigious and most sacred of all Islamic art forms, flowers are frequently used as illuminated backgrounds. The inscription here actually says, "In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful," and the illuminator has shown this fantastic garden of beautiful flowers that completely fills the dark blue background behind it. Persian Romantic poetry glorifies the garden. And most of the most romantic scenes in Persian love stories seem to take place in gardens. This miniature of the Romance of Humayun and Humayun, we don't know where the whole manuscript is. It's a single miniature in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, now part of the Great Louvre. We see what I think of as perhaps the most beautiful of all paradisiacal images in Islamic art. It's nighttime, the moon and stars are in the sky. On the fence and wall around this garden, you can see that there are torches gleaming. In the garden itself, in the background, a serpentine stream runs through the garden, and on either bank, we see a profusion of flowers and beautiful fruit trees, while in the foreground, each one with their chaperone, a prince and a princess upon seeing each other for the first time, fall, of course, madly in love. And here we can see that scene in the foreground. So gardens, as a setting for romance, are also a very powerful image in the history of Islamic art. Here we see part of a detail of a lacquered pen box from the Springfield Museums, a qalamdan done with a garden imagery. Here we see a small garden of flowers over here, which is decorating the royal monogram of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, as designed by the artist Karamemi around 1560. Here we see a portrait in words of the Prophet Muhammad, in which the Prophet Muhammad is also metaphorically represented as both a rosebud and as a rose. That is, as the Prophet is a part of a garden, in fact. We do know from the hadith and the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad that he was fond of putting rose oil in his beard. This is why outside of mosques throughout the Islamic world, you can frequently find somebody selling rose oil, but it also is another link between the Prophet and the idea of flowers, and they're not only their beautiful sight, but their beautiful smell as well. Ottoman ceramics from Iznik, Turkey, are of course famous for their floral depictions, and the most famous of the Ottoman flowers, seen in red on the left and in blue on the right, is the tulip. Also here are roses, hyacinths, and frequently, not in these two examples, but frequently also carnations as well. In India, the art of Pietrodura, the inlaying of semi-precious stone into snow white, perfectly white marble, seen here the process on the right-hand side, and an example from the museum in Kuwait, leads also to garden imagery. And once again, I want to point out to you, not only do we have the cypress trees on the left-hand side here, two of them, we have three bouquets of flowers, one species on the outside, one on both sides, one in the middle. But we also have something else which frequently begins to appear in gardens, and which, of course, is a feature of all gardens, and that is birds and beasts who are attracted by the green trees and the flowers and the water to come and inhabit these places. That is, gardens have a fauna as well as a floral aspect. Getting to the end of these examples here, carved stone. We wouldn't think necessarily of carved hard stone or marble as being something that lends itself to garden imagery. But in fact, here we have a cistern lid from the Topkapi Palace, gilded with floral designs of tulips all over it, a detail of a timbered tombstone in, of all places, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, and the side panel of a magnificent carved marble pulpit in the Mosque of Sultan Ahmet I in Istanbul. It's also worth reminding ourselves that the Islamic garden is one of the most enduring Islamic images in the mythological views of Islam, the Orientalist views of Islam held in the West. These two paintings by John Frederick Lewis, showing beautiful women from the Islamic world surrounded by gorgeous flowers and gardens, are part of the European image of the Islamic world. That is, the Islamic world is thought of as a place of the cultivation of flowers. This is something that is really quite an interesting phenomenon, since I can't go into it in detail today, but it is very interesting that flowers are considered something of a bit of a sissy image, or something very feminine in the West. And in the Islamic world, we frequently see, especially in the Ottoman Empire, the depiction of great warriors and sultans and people of immense physical presence who are shown as cultured individuals smelling a flower. Now let's turn to carpets. The woven garden in Islamic art is seen in many different media, as I've already shown you, but today we're going to take a look now at the imagery of the great knotted pile carpets. Now, this is not a carpet in the form of a Chahar Bagh garden here. Some of you may recognize this. It's one of the two famous emperor's carpets, the one in Vienna and one in the Metropolitan Museum. This is the Metz example, which was extensively restored and exhibited at the opening of the Metz New Galleries in 2011. And if we look at it carefully, we can see a number of things. It's a rectangle, well, just like the garden is. It's got a border around the outside, a kind of a wall around the outside. And in the middle, in a contrasting color, it's got vast numbers of flowers, but also a number of birds and beasts, quite a few of them, as a matter of fact. And then all the way around the central field, there is a lengthy poem in Persian, in rhymed couplets. Did I say cutlets? In rhymed couplets. It goes all the way around the outside. Here we can see the animals, the various sorts of animals in the garden. It's worth remembering, by the way, that large walled enclosures were constructed, especially in later Islamic times, especially in India, for what we call a batu, a controlled hunt, where animals were confined within a particular area and could be hunted by aristocrats on horseback. It's not, to my mind, very sporting. It's kind of like what they used to call in southern United States a shooting fish in a barrel. Not very sportsmanlike to my way of thinking, but at any rate, there's also this idea here of the garden as a place of the hunt and with all of its associated imagery. And here we can see one single line of the poem, and it's interesting. The poem is a self-panegyric. That is to say, when we read inscriptions, what art historians want to see is they want to see this work of art was produced by so-and-so at such and such a place at such and such a time. We almost never get that. We're never that lucky. Nope, this inscription is basically the carpet is kind of bragging about itself. It's not unusual to find inscribed garden images in Islam that say, I have the most beautiful garden in the world. This one is a little bit less blatant about it, but it does, in this line from this marvelous early 13th century CE poem, the meadow displays 1,000 green, I've got a green tents of rosebuds at dawn when the cloud pitches a tent over the rose garden. So the carpet proclaims itself as a garden. There's you don't have to worry about this being tentative. Are we sure that it's a garden? Are we not sure it's a garden? No, we have it right from the horse's mouth here. The carpet tells us exactly what it is. Now, the most amazing artistic associations with the idea of the Chahar Bagh garden that we encounter in the art of the Islamic world, however, do not begin to arise until around the early 17th century of the Common Era, when in Kerman, in central Persia, this enormous carpet, there may have been others. Remember that in carpets, we only probably have a tiny percentage of what originally existed. This is the earliest surviving garden carpet in the form of a Chahar Bagh. And if you look at it carefully, you can see it's a big fourfold garden that is divided into yet smaller fourfold gardens, that it is basically laid out with different, very brilliantly colored backgrounds showing various kinds of flowering trees. There are water courses everywhere, and some of them actually have animal combats in them. Some of them have various and assorted fish. You see large numbers of fish here, and ducks, aquatic birds as well. And the water itself is shown as little ripples woven into the knotted pile carpet. This is an amazing work of art. It's gigantic. It's in Jaipur in the Albert Hall Museum in India. And the most interesting thing about this carpet is that as enormous as it is, unlike most Persian carpets, where you can walk around the carpet and basically it's meant to be seen from all sides, it is very clear from the design of this one in the middle that it was meant to be seen from one end. We see very clearly depicted here a small domed garden pavilion surrounded by water in which fish, turtles, and then even an animal combat between two birds and another one between two animals are clearly visible with little clouds at the top. What we're looking at here then is a very vivid, a very original depiction of a garden in which the ripples on the water are also shown in this highly stylized manner. Well, the Jaipur carpet is the earliest and in many respects the most splendid of the surviving garden design carpets that have come down to us today. But it stands today all alone because no others of the period appear to have survived. This carpet, woven, as I mentioned, in Central Persia, in Kerman, stands at the head of a long tradition of later garden carpets in the Iranian tradition. Here, for example, we see one of the most splendid and one of the largest of these, the Aga Khan Garden Carpet now in Kuwait from the 18th century. There is no longer a pavilion in the center of this carpet, but we do see a pool in which, quite against the laws of nature, we have, instead of fish, we have a peafowl, 4 of them, a bird which is actually not very fond of getting its feet wet. Nevertheless, the carpet is also, we could see that it's a fourfold carpet, four times a fourfold carpet, and that in fact, if you look at it carefully in the picture on the left-hand side, it's not symmetrical. It actually was a bit longer at the end, closer to the photographer in the left-hand image, which, by the way, was taken in Kuwait before the Iraqi invasion at the time of the opening of the National Museum and the Al-Sabah collection in Kuwait quite a while ago. Now, here is the Aga Khan carpet seen directly from above, where the asymmetry is more pronounced, and where you can see that the patterns in the water have been developed into a very definitely stylized chevron shape, a geometric shape. The amplification of the fourfold garden, actually, this is originally 4 six-fold gardens, you might say, into one gigantic carpet, gives you, of course, a garden that is in bloom year-round, as the Jaipur carpet is. You have your flowering trees, all of your wonderful imagery of the heavenly and the earthly garden, and you're not dependent upon the seasons to have these blossoms. It's sort of, I suppose, in some ways, a remote analogy to having silk flowers in a vase during the winter when there are none to be picked in your garden. It was very common back in earlier times in Islamic lands when there were questions of inheritance, to take large carpets and to cut them up into fractions. I know it seems kind of monstrous to us today, the whole concept. Definitely not a Solomonic, one might say, idea of cutting something into pieces to distribute among various people. But this is a large fragment of a carpet similar in size to the Aga Khan in the Metropolitan Museum. This is, as you can see from the picture, an enormous fragment of just one end of this truly gigantic carpet, not quite the size of an original garden, but pretty close to it. One also can see then the Aga Khan type of carpet exists in a number of examples. This happens to be a 20th century Iranian carpet that interprets the Aga Khan in a much smaller size, but otherwise copies it quite exactly. That carpet and other carpets like it had a very strong impact on the subsequent history of Persian carpet weaving. And then there are smaller examples like this one here, a tiny little garden carpet, sort of a front yard garden carpet, you might say, from the Louvre in Paris. And another singleton carpet of the same type of design in the Metropolitan Museum. I'm showing you 2 photographs here, by the way, the photograph from the Met's website on the right and the photograph of the carpet as it actually looks after I took the Met's photograph and played around with it in Photoshop. It's it's useful for us. I couldn't resist doing this. It's useful for us to remember that that photography is a scientific pursuit in which science sometimes gets in the way of art. Then we have from the 19th century in the Kurdish, that is the western part of Iran, the long garden rugs. Many of these are quite long, as the McMullen rug shown in this ancient photograph hanging in the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard University on the right-hand side demonstrates very long carpets, fairly coarsely woven, not at all in the technique of the earlier ones, but still with the very same kind of design. And the slightly smaller one in the Metropolitan Museum, you see to the left-hand side. And now we come to a point in this talk in which we begin to take a look at the main reason for my being here with you, and that is the travels of the Wagner Carpet from Glasgow to North America. It first went to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and after that to Houston, and finally is now, today in Toronto, at the Aga Khan Museum, where it is on display and where those who are in attendance in the auditorium at the museum will be able to see it after the talk. The Glasgow Museum, while undergoing renovations, made the generous decision to send the carpet on tour, sort of like sending the holy relics on tour from a medieval cathedral in a way. And it was a wonderful opportunity for those of us in varying parts of North America to have the opportunity to actually, it's a marvelous chance to actually see this carpet in the wool. The Wagner Garden Carpet is not quite, we don't think quite as early as the Jaipur carpet, but earlier than all of the other carpets that we've just had a look at. And here we can see that it is not of the same plan or proportions as other vase carpets, and yet, like the others, like the other early one, it is almost certainly a product of the weaving of an atelier in Kerman in central Persia. Instead of having a cruciform system of watercourses, it has watercourses in the form of an H, with the central pool heavily restored and renapped. As you see here, the renapping has discolored. It was not, the dye stuffs used in the restoration were not as good as the dye stuffs used in the original carpet, and they tended to bleach out over time. This notwithstanding, the Wagner Garden Carpet, so-called after a former owner from Glasgow, is one of the greatest surviving Persian carpets. And its interest lies for us mainly not just in the flora, which are quite interesting, but also in the wide variety of fauna which it shows. It's got the traditional construction of a Kerman carpet, different kinds of wefts, cotton, wool, and silk, a cotton warp, and has an unusual layout and shape. The condition is generally quite good, and the layout, as we saw also in the Jaipur carpet, is such unusual for a Persian carpet that it has a definite top and bottom to be viewed. It is to be viewed from a particular angle. And it's a very good-sized carpet, as you can see here in this wonderful photograph from Scotland that shows us the central pool with aquatic birds as well as fish, and you can get some idea of the large number of animals and the fact that it has multiple points of view, with the trees pointing upward and downward away from the actually pointing upward away from the watercourses in almost every single case here. This is a carpet of extremely imaginative design, especially in the way that the designer played around with the idea of overlapping forms, of having the trees, for example, and some of the animals overlapping the borders of the watercourses to give a very interesting kind of playful three-dimensional aspect to the surface of the carpet. Here is the bottom half of the carpet. As you can see here, it is meant to be looked at from all sides and all angles. It has no overriding point of view, although the central medallion suggests that it's meant to be seen from the bottom, and as I show it to you here, and also the direction of the pile. That is, every carpet, like the back of a cat, has a nap that goes in a particular direction, and this is very definitely the bottom of the carpet. The direction of the pile points downward, which is a help when it's illuminated, hanging on a wall. It's much easier to light a carpet because of that downward-facing pile. And here we can see the upper half of the carpet. A series of very interesting trees with flowers on them, animals of all kinds, and an enormous variety of birds. Most of the animals are keeping their fangs off of each other. There are a few actual combats that we can see here. The birds are a variety, from the very large peafowl to smaller birds. And we even see here and there little wiggly forms, if you look carefully, that are in fact clouds. That is, clouds as they were taken over in Iran from Chinese prototypes, little wiggly clouds that turn up in the middle of this very lush garden that we see here. And if we take a look down here at this particular detail, taken, as you can see, from the side of the carpet, you can see I call your attention to more or less the lower left-hand quadrant here, where we see a little blue animal that is actually stepping over the border, and the same thing is of the stepping over the border of the watercourse. And then look over to the lower right-hand side of this image, and there you can see a multicolored tree whose roots actually go, and whose trunk goes over the bottom as well. Now, we call carpets in this particular technique vase technique carpets, because the eponymous type of carpet, which you see on the left-hand side here, woven in Kerman in the 17th century, has an extremely unusual kind of construction, where a very thick weft was pulled tightly between each, from one side of the carpet to the other after being shot, and then a sinuous silk weft. The thick weft was generally made out of cotton or sometimes wool, and then a very sinuous silk weft was then, and much thinner silk weft was then put into the construction of the carpet. So-called vase carpets, in fact, you can see the vases that give the carpet its name. I've used these three yellow arrows to show them to you. And so-called vase carpets actually come in a tremendous variety of designs, including this very attractive design of leaves and blossoms that you see on a carpet once belonging to a member of the Rothschild family on the right-hand side, that was recently sold for an enormous price at auction. And like almost all carpets that sell for enormous prices at auctions, ended up, we are told, in the Persian Gulf. The vase technique, here you can see three different vase technique carpets, a small fragment from Harvard University on the left, a carpet from a collection in Madrid on the right, and in the middle, a detail of the Wagner carpet, which has also borrowed from the repertoire of designs that we find in Kerman, a small vase. It's on a sconce or a bracket, you might say, underneath it, because it would have been put on a wall in a house with its little flowers. The flowers have been picked due to the fact the fragment on the left-hand side is a fragment composed of several fragments, but we can see the full bunch of blossoms on the right-hand side, and also on the detail in the middle. Other carpets in this technique, I should mention just parenthetically, that perhaps of the most famous carpet in the vase carpet technique, along with the Wagner carpet and a few others, is this carpet formerly in the Corcoran collection, in the collection of the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C., recently sold at auction for the highest price ever gained by any carpet sold at auction so far in human history, which also the famous sickle leaf carpet from the Corcoran, not a very big carpet, I might add, which means, of course, much easier to display, ended up also, we are informed, in a collection in the Persian Gulf. Now, one of the interesting features of the vase carpets, vase technique carpets, like the Wagner carpet, is the fact that after they wear, one begins to see rows of parallel warps on the front, and the warps also begin to lie almost bare on the back of the carpet. No other carpet quite looks like a vase technique carpet. When you look at it, it's one of the easiest carpets to identify as to its technique by sight. And I show you these two details to show you what the back tends to look like, especially after wear, and at what the front looks like also after the centuries have passed. Now, as I mentioned, the visual and artistic impact of the Wagner carpet lies not only in its unusual proportions and in its unusual layout of the watercourses, but also in the extraordinary variety of the small forms that we see in the carpet. Whether it's in the very upper center of the detail on the left here, a rabbit which is munching away at a flower on top of a border, a duck happily swimming in the water, or another animal of some sort, a quadruped, with its head underneath the border that we see lower down in the center of the carpet. And on the right-hand side, we also see this tremendous variety of fish in the water, some of which seem to have almost what looks like smiles on their faces, and all kinds of animals. It's a very vigorous design. It's a very creative design, and it is very little repetitive. The layout is repetitive, but if you look at, for example, in the upper left-hand image here, at the two different trees, one of which seems to have a rainbow of colors, the other one of which is all green with flowers growing up in front of it, you'll see that there is a tremendous variety in the carpet, and that it is not, in fact, either symmetrical, side to side, nor symmetrical top to bottom. There's always something a little bit off center, a little bit off beat. Let me go back to this image one more time just to show you the two lower images here on the right and the left. In showing fauna in this carpet, we not only have birds, we have birds, and we have certainly various sorts of mammals, quadrupeds of many different genus. We have rodents, we have deer, we have all kinds of different animals. We have what we call lagomorphs, that is to say, we've got rabbits as well. But I want to call your attention to the bugs, the moths or butterflies, more likely we'll call them butterflies, that we see down here in the lower left and lower right images in pairs to either side of that little vertical stripe here. So even the insects are well represented in this extraordinary carpet. And here we see it on display in the museum in Toronto, where, as I mentioned before, those of you who are fortunate enough today to be in attendance in the auditorium can go and take a look at it after the talk is over and enjoy seeing it, as it were, in the wool. I want to end this lecture. I'm not going to go through all of this. I decided to put in some reading in case any of you wanted to go further on looking at vase carpets in Islamic gardens. And this will be certainly when this goes up. I don't know whether it's going to go up on the website or YouTube, how it's going to be made public, but you'll be able to if you're bored to death now, you can bore yourself to death a second time by listening to me one time again, in case you missed anything. My students say you drop a pencil, you miss 100 years. I'm trying to speak slowly. I don't know how successful I am. And I also just wanted to have some acknowledgments here at the end. John Thompson, the great carpet scholar who died recently in London. May Hamilton Beattie, one of the great titans of carpet discovery, who was the first person to look very carefully at the Jaipur vase carpet. And Dr. Abdullah Guchani, the late Dr. Abdullah Guchani, who died of COVID in Iran just a short time ago, and who for years I worked with at the Metropolitan Museum. It was his epigraphical work that led to the translations of the inscriptions on the emperor's carpet that we looked at when we first started looking at carpets. So that's the end of my presentations. And now the easiest way to do this, I think, is to go and show you images of 5 of the show and tell objects that we have picked here. And I will talk a little bit about them. And then at the end, I understand that we're going to be able to have some questions. You may have some questions. If you have questions while I'm talking, put them into the chat where we can see them, or the Q&A. But I'm going to just show you 5 carpets from Toronto that have been offered up for discussion by members of the audience. The first of these, absolutely beautiful colors, is a somewhat fragmentary Demirci carpet from Western Anatolia. It's only got a border on one side. The border is missing on the other sides. It's definitely very floral in its imagery. In the border, if we look carefully, we can see Turkish fan-shaped red carnations and blue tulips. And in the field, we've got every conceivable type of blossom that you could think of. It is not in the design of a formal garden with the cross axes and the pools, but it definitely is garden imagery made all the more vibrant by the absolute extraordinary reflectivity of the wool, which is extremely soft, and the amazing intensity of all of the colors that we see in it. Not that many colors. It looks like there must be 20 colors here. There are only 8. But an absolutely gorgeous example of Western Anatolian weaving, even in fragmentary form. It has the power to move us by its extraordinary colors and beautiful design. The second one is this Chivan carpet from East Transcaucasia, shown nicely in a snowbank, by the way. Great place to lay your carpet on the ground in the winter because you don't get any bugs in the carpet. This type of design has been, by some, likened to a garden design largely because of the way that those two up and 2 down small rectangles move into the carpet. It's thought that a carpet of this sort, created in the late 19th century in the eastern part of the Transcaucasus, might be reflections of an earlier Persian garden design. You can see that, like many carpets from this part of the world, they have an almost infinite variety of borders. This is quite an unusual one. And then small medallions in repeat 9 of them. Our third work is an embroidery from Uzbekistan, known as a Suzani, consisting of silk embroidered on a cotton or sometimes a linen ground underneath. These colorful embroideries from Uzbekistan are also quite gorgeous because of their colors, and they are almost always floral in design. So again, the evocation of a garden very powerfully here. Now, unlike the knotted pile carpets that we've just looked at, which are composed, as is the image on the television screen, the monitor screen that I'm looking at, of very large numbers of individually colored pixels, the embroidery is the textile equivalent of drawing. You can actually, what you're doing is you're taking a needle and colored thread, and you are, as though you were using crayons or colored pencils, but you're simply using the needle to apply these lines and these solid areas to this very, very beautiful and asymmetrical, and all the more beautiful because of it, embroidered garden. Now, here's something, a little bit of a wild card here. I wasn't going to show you this, but there is a theory, and I want to stress that it's a theory, that particular Turkoman tent bags like this, woven by the Yomud tribe, and meant to be hung on the walls of Turkoman tents, might reflect the idea of looking straight down upon orderly rows of trees in a garden. I will tell you from my point of view, without wanting to be dogmatic about this, that I don't think that's the case. But it's very interesting that not only do we want not only do Islamic artists want to portray gardens, but at times, even maybe when they weren't intent on portraying gardens, that those of us in the West who look at Islamic art want to see a garden of rows of trees and something like this. I think that the idea of this being a garden doesn't necessarily reveal artistic intent on the part of the weaver. It says an awful lot, however, on the part of the intent of those of us who view it in a Western context. And last, but certainly not least, and certainly probably the oddest thing we look at this afternoon, is this kilim, tapestry woven kilim from someplace in the Ottoman Balkans, one of the the absolute bottomless, infinitely rich bag of tricks that is, and of beautiful things that forms part of the collection of the Torontonians, Marshall and Marilyn Wolfe, a kilim whose colors are quite disconcerting, especially that pink, not something you ever would see in an Anatolian piece from Turkey, but whose design is clearly showing us leaves, blossoms, pomegranates, all kinds of floral forms, still the favorite design for Islamic textile weavers. And with this image, number 5, we end my part of today's festivities. And I think I will now try to invite Phyllis and the folks in Toronto to sort of take control of things, and maybe we can have some questions and some comments.
Thank you so much, Walter. And I hope everyone can join me to give a physical and virtual applause to our speakers. Walter, I have seen we have some in the chat that many people were very happy with your presentation and its depth, and we have also some questions in our Q&A box. But I want to start the questions by my own. When we have the tours around the Wagner Garden Carpet, we always face this multifaceted importance of the carpet and how the weaver were playing with our mind, having a garden carpet, but also having a vase carpet in it, and having such a rich animal presentation. I ask myself, is there also another hint to the hunting carpets? So I see at least 3 different versions on one carpet.
That's right. And of course, we know that the hunting carpet, thanks to that marvelous exhibition, which was at the Asia Society some years ago, called Hunt for Paradise, which is about the hunt for a walled garden in Islamic art, where John Thompson and Sheila Canby pointed out to us that the hunt is 2 things again: an actual hunt, the sport of kings in the Islamic world, and also a metaphor. The hunter and the prey are the metaphor of the soul's longing after paradise and the soul's search for the divine. And it's all there. It's all there. One place.
Another question you mentioned in at least in 2 different garden carpets that the trees are totally connected to the water channels, and by Wagner Garden Carpet they are literally in the channels and absorbing water. Is there any reason why the weavers are making such a significant, detailed the depiction of the connection between trees and water?
I wish I knew the answer to that. The fascinating thing about the Wagner carpet is it's different from all the others. Keep in mind, by the way, that we probably have 2 to 3% from the 17th century. 2 to 3% of all the carpets woven in the 17th century are still extant. Most of them were completely worn out, burned, eaten by weevils, or just burned, destroyed, and all we have left is a tiny number of things. We're fortunate to have such wonderful things that have survived. I have no idea why the artists of the Wagner carpet were doing all of this playful stuff. I have to say that I would love to have met the designer of the Wagner carpet, because he probably had a much better sense of humor than the designers of most carpets that I know. The Wagner carpet is full of all kinds of little funny vignettes that should give you great pleasure, should bring a smile to your face.
I'm so sorry. I have one more question, then I will leave. Is there any explanation why Wagner Garden Carpet have the direction of the trees on the first half different than on the second half?
That's another case of them. I think they're just playing around with you. I think that the designer of the carpet was just having fun, doing all kinds of unexpected things on the part of the viewer. There's no consistency. Consistency, as they say, is the hobgoblin of small minds. Anyway, there's a great deal of symmetry in the Wagner carpet, left-right. Certainly not top-bottom, but there's something for everybody there. All I can think of is that the designer of that carpet said, just tried to do as many fascinatingly different things as they could, and they probably were trying to keep the viewer a little bit off balance.
There is a question from Stephen Lonker in our Q&A box. He would like to know, if you can read the question, he would like to know the relation between the prehistoric Iranian Chahar Bagh and how it's later on developed by the Muslims.
Well, it's simply a case of the continuity of Persian culture. When I was in graduate school, I read a book on ancient Persia by the great Persian scholar at Harvard University, and it was a history of classical Iran. And the last chapter in that book was called "The Persian Conquest of Islam." Now, we all know that what happened at the end of the Persian Empire was that Islam overran the Middle East and conquered Persia. But in fact, if you take a look at the history of Iran through millennia, it's amazing that every conqueror who ever conquered Iran was conquered by the culture of the place. Look at Alexander the Great. He really annoyed the old grunts from Macedonia in his army when he told them they all had to marry Persian wives, start eating Persian food, and dress like Persians. Look at what happened when the Seljuk Turks took over Iran in the 11th century CE. They became more Persian than the Persians. The same thing happened with the Mongols. When they took over Iran, what happened? That we see the most amazing examples of the Iranian national epic. The illustrated examples of the Shahnameh were created under Mongol rule of Iran. So the idea that the Chahar Bagh would, in fact, not only persist in Islamic times in Iran, but flourish to an amazing degree, that shouldn't be a surprise at all. It's the most amazing thing about Iranian civilization, and that it is amazingly persistent. Iran has spent a very large part of its history under foreign rule, and yet the Iranian culture always managed to survive and indeed to dominate.
There is one question from Robert Roth. I'm not sure if you can answer, but I rely on your expertise. Where is the sickle leaf carpet now that it was sold from the Corcoran?
The great magnet for all great works of Islamic art, and that's not only the sickle leaf carpet from the Corcoran, but also Alistair Rothschild's blue ground leaf carpet, is I would not say this with 100% accuracy, but I have very good reason to believe that both of those carpets are now in Doha, in Qatar.
Okay. Gord would like to know the crescent wrenches in the outer borders of the Baku carpet are indeed odd, or might they really represent something related to the gardens?
These little double-ended motifs? No, I think they're just part of this particular weaver's amazing ingenuity in creating pattern. I've never seen another border like this. And that's one of the interesting things about these late Caucasian carpets is that they've got amazing, amazing variety, especially in their borders. The fields are pretty predictable, but it's almost anything goes in the borders. I have not the faintest idea what we're looking at here, but it sure is interesting.
I thank you from bottom of my heart for this lecture. I know we have been working since 8 months to have this lecture, and due to COVID, we postponed many times because I insist having you in person at in Toronto. But I'm very pleased that we could realize this and have you virtually attending from where you are and having so many guests from all over the world. Thank you so much, Walter.
Thank you. It's been a delightful experience.